Good morning, friends. In this video, we will discuss about some basics of some concepts of Spring AOP, right? AOP stands for Aspect-Oriented Programming, right? So Spring has its own AOP and Spring has an integration with Aspect-J also, right? So these aspects enable the modularization of concerns such as transaction management, logging, exception handling, security, profiling, caching, etc., right? So even this is termed as cross-cutting concerns, right? So if you look at this slide, so this is a three-tier architecture where we have presentation layer, business layer, and data access layer. In the presentation layer, we have few controllers, REST controllers. Business layer we use @service. Data access layer we use @repository, right? And these are all our components, right? And if you want to apply this cross-cutting concerns, we can apply for all the layers. We can apply for all the layers, a selected layer, or within the layer also we can apply to selected controllers or services, or inside that particular methods also we can apply it. Right, so that is how the cross-cutting concerns can be applied to our components, right? If you look at this slide here, so this is one example of business type where we have an account bean and with @service. Like, @service is a stereotype annotation, so which indicates that this is a business component, right? Which implements some interface, and it has few methods like deposit, withdraw, balance, right? And in the client application, we are injecting using AutoWire, we are injecting the account bean into iAccount interface, right? And calling account.deposit method. Here, when I say client application, it could be like a presentation layer where we can use a REST controller. Because it's a business layer, this component will be injected into presentation layer, right? Now, in this component, if you see this account bean, we will have methods with a business logic, right? We are going to have a business logic. Now, suppose if you want to have cross-cutting concerns, normally what we do, along with the business logic, we are going to add cross-cutting concerns like security, logging, transaction, exception handling, everything. But if you write this code inside the business component, inside these methods, and these methods becomes unmanageable. It becomes very complex also. Because as a developer, when you're writing some business component, we would focus more on business logic rather than cross-cutting concerns, right? So we should not write this cross-cutting concerns inside our code, like exception handling, logging, everything must be externalized, right? So this is where, if you look at this, Spring AOP, what it will do is it'll create a proxy object. Dynamically, it can create a proxy object by implementing the same interface. If you see here, our component, business component uses iAccount interface. This proxy which got dynamically generated also uses the same interface. Because advantage would be in the client application, whoever is calling, so the client is going to use that interface. Client is also going to use that interface. So the implementation can come as the business component, then directly the target, or it can come as a proxy object. And if you look at this here, in the business component, we have just business logic, but inside the proxy, these cross-cutting concerns are written, like security, logging, transaction, everything will go to proxy. And advantage of this is our business component will have simply the business logic, okay? And the service logic will be separately created by the proxy object, and this proxy can be created for not only this bean, it can create for any bean using AOP point cut concept, point cut feature, we can do it, right? Let us discuss about AOP terminology. Aspect stands for, it's a class, contains one or more advices, right? And there is join point. Join point is nothing but, it is any point in the target. For example, in your business component, okay, in a class, anything, there is a method execution could be a join point, or field access is a join point. But Spring supports method execution as a join point, right? So join point is where we are going to apply this cross-cutting concerns, right? Then, as I said, aspect is one or more advices. What is advice? Advice represents an action to be taken by an aspect at a particular join point, right? For example, we are calling deposit method. Deposit method is the join point. For that deposit method, what cross-cutting logic we want to apply, like transaction, security, logging, exception handling, right? So there are different types of advices, like before advice, similarly, after return advice, after throwing advice, after advice, around advice. Like that, we have different types of advices, right? So when I say before advice, it is before the join point, but that is before calling the deposit method, some method, right? Then after returning is nothing but once the method is successfully executed, then it comes to after return advice. Similarly, after throwing is nothing but if there is an exception in the method, the business component method which we are calling. So if there is an exception, then it comes to after throwing. Similarly, there is a after or finally advice. The purpose of this is whether the method is successfully executed or not. So even if exception throws also, it comes to this particular advice. And there is one more advice called around advice. The purpose of around advice is it is executed before and after the join point. So like as mentioned in the account bean, like we have a method called deposit. When you're calling deposit method, before and after, we can use around advice. Or just before, we can use before advice. An exception comes in that, then it can come to throws advice, right? So for example for before advice is applying some security logic. So whenever we are calling method, we will check for authentication, authorization, some security. So that can be applied using before advice. Similarly, if you want to generate some logs, right? Because logs will be before the method and after the method also we have to generate the logs, right? So we can go for around advice. Similarly, if you want to implement transaction management, because transaction management also there's a before where we start transaction, then after is nothing but commit or rollback where we use around advice. And another example of around advice would be profiling. Suppose we want to know one particular method, how much time it has taken to execute. In that case, we use around advice to start the watch before the method call and stop the watch after the method call and calculate how much time it has taken. Similarly, whenever you are calling some method, if that method throws some exception, then to handle the exceptions, so we can go for after throwing advice, right? So these are all the different types of advices which are available. Similarly, the target. So what is target here? So it is a business component. Target could be anything. It could be a controller, it could be a service, it could be a repository, it could be a component, anything, right? Where the advice are applied to the join points, right? Then comes to proxy. Like in the previous slide, we have seen proxy, right? Proxies are dynamically generated, right? So what is proxy here? Proxy is nothing but the target object. In the target object, the join point, like methods, plus advice becomes a proxy, right? And if you look at this slide here, this image also here, so we have an aspect with one or more advisors, and this is our target, right? Suppose you say account bean, this is account bean class. Here we have deposit, withdraw, info, there are a few methods are there. Each method is like a join point, right? And there is a point cut you can hear. In the point cut we are going to mention, so in the target, which join point this advice must be applied. So that whenever we call these methods, automatically it goes through the advice. So that is how the AOP will get implemented. Now let us discuss about one simple example of AOP, right? So here I have one project. So in this project, if you see pom.xml, like there are a few dependencies for AOP, right? Spring AOP. Similarly, AspectJ related dependency. So I told you Spring uses AspectJ, especially when it comes to annotations when you're using. So we use Spring AspectJ for applying the AOP, right? And the version here I'm using is around 5.1.3 version. You can use any latest version, right? And here there is a main application. You can see the main application. Similarly, there is a simple service. This is our business component, which has a method called display, right? And here it is annotated as @simple service, stereotype annotation with some name like simple service, right? Now, the advice is this. So we are using some tracing advice here. So this is the tracing advice, right? Like I told you, when you want to apply some advices, how do you define the advices? The class must be annotated with @aspect. So we have to put @aspect, and inside that we can write any number of advices by writing annotation, by putting annotation @around, before, throws, etc. Right? And this example is about tracing advice. Nothing but we want to display how much time a method execution took, right? And here around, you can see the code actually here. So there is before proceeding to the method. Suppose we are calling deposit method. So before proceeding that method, first we are using to start the watch. Actually, the stopwatch is some utility class, right? Using that utility class, we are starting the watch. Then say proceed to the target method. Then once it is back, then we are going to stop the watch and calculate the time here. So we can say stopwatch dot get total time milliseconds, right? So this is how we can define the aspect. Inside the aspect, we can have the advices, right? And there is a stereotype annotation like @component. So what is the purpose of this is when component scan happens, right? It can scan only for stereotype annotations. That's why we need to put @component here, right? And when it comes to main application, if you look at the main application, here what is written. So we have mentioned @configuration, right? So what do you mean by @configuration is there is no XML where we define the beans. All the beans are annotated. That is the @configuration. Similarly, we are using component scan here. So component scan, the purpose of this is to scan the stereotype annotations under this particular package, demo.spring as a base package, or the sub package also, it is going to search for it, right? And to enable ASP.J, we need to have one more annotation called enable ASP.J auto proxy. This is very important, right? Because this will detect the @aspect and create a proxy object and apply the advices to the target here, right? And if you look at the code, it's very simple, where we are creating an application context of type annotation config application context, because we are not using any beans.xml file, anything. We are using annotation driven, right? And we are calling the bean here. If you observe here, simple service, we are calling using context.getBean of simple service, right? Now here, interesting point is the return object is a proxy object. So for example, here, the return object is a proxy object, because we have mentioned in the advice, we have mentioned anything starts with demo.spring.service. You see, this is called point cut here. So demo.spring.service, which is the package here, right? So here, if you see, demo.spring.service is a package. Then after that, dot is mentioned. That means in that package, as well as the sub packages, dot means any class, star means of any method. In the braces, you see bracket, you can see dot means any number of argument or no argument, this around advice will be applied. So this is what is a point cut, very important, right? So we discussed join point is nothing but method level execution, but which join point this advice has to be applied, so that we have to define using point cut. So based on this point cut, automatically the proxy will be created. Because the simple service comes under that point cut, automatically this is proxied, and whenever we call this particular method, display method, and that service object, it goes through that around advice, right? So it comes to here, it starts the watch, then proceed to the display method, come back, stop the watch, and display how much time it has taken, right? So let us test this application. I'll start the main application here. So when I run the main application, if you observe the output here, so display method is called here, right? So we got the output from this display method. At the same time, we got total time taken is 17 milliseconds. So this information is coming from the advice, right? So here, when you apply the advice, here we are getting this output, right? That means we are able to successfully apply the cross-cutting concern, that is nothing but profiling, tracing to a particular method, right? So this is what is the main point here. Here we can define, is it for a particular package or multiple packages, a particular class or a particular method, anything like point cut we can mention. Based on this, automatically, here we are given enable ASP.J auto proxy, which will create a proxy object so that any call to our business component will go through the advices, right?